first Employee Ownership Association webinar. My name is Cathy Brown and I'm the Operations Director at the EOA, the Employee Ownership Association. And today, surprisingly enough, our topic is actually employee ownership. And our speakers are Jeremy Gadd and Robert Postlethwaite, and I'll be coming over to Jeremy and Robert to introduce themselves in a moment. But firstly, I wanted to take a little while to provide some context to the EOA and to employee ownership itself. And for those of you in the audience particularly who might just be starting to explore the subject, we are the membership body for organisations that are owned by their employees, either through direct ownership, through employee ownership trusts or employee benefit trusts, or by a hybrid model that combines a number of those options. The most common example of this, the one people are most familiar with, is the John Lewis Partnership, but there are many others throughout the UK as well, including recently Lush, Richer Sounds and Aardman Animations. Hundreds of UK businesses have actually gone down this route to transform their business. EO businesses can be large or small, they can come from any sector of the economy, and the sector is actually worth over £30 billion per annum to the UK economy and is growing. So evidence demonstrates that employee-owned businesses are more engaged, they're more productive, they're more profitable, and those businesses are growing as well. EOA membership covers organisations that have already transitioned and become employee-owned, that are on that journey. They're exploring their options, and also organisations that support businesses that are going through that transition. We are a not-for-profit, politically independent organisation working in partnership with a diverse range of partners to champion employee ownership as an economic and as a social enabler. Our mission is to influence, inspire and support employee ownership to become more respected, more widespread and more successful throughout the UK. So today's webinar will cover some key elements of that transition and of being an employee-owned business once you make that transition. And we will hear from our expert advisors, Robert and Jeremy, and then we will open up to your questions. So within the webinar setup, you should find a screen marked Q&A, and you can submit your questions there to us. So please do that. I will pick them up and we will put them to Robert and Jeremy after their introduction. And if we don't get through all of the questions, which is quite possible, we will take a note of them all and we will collate some material with Robert and Jeremy and we will put that out to you afterwards as well. So please do put those questions in and we will get through as many as we can in the time that we have. So I'll hand over to our expert advisors and ask them to introduce themselves and start us up. Jeremy and Robert, over to you.
Okay, good morning. Thank you very much, Cathy. If you've tuned in looking for an update on the government's latest Brexit proposals to the European Union, you're definitely in the wrong place, so do tune out now. If you want to find out more about employee ownership, which I think you're likely to find much more nourishing, then stay with us. We'll start with some introductions. I'm Robert Postlethwaite. I'm the Managing Director of a law firm called Postlethwaite, of which I was the founder. And all we do is work with companies that want to become employee owned. So I'll tell you a little bit more about what we do, then I'll hand over to Jeremy. He can tell you from his own viewpoint what his firm does. So we really do two things. We'll sit down with a company and figure out what exactly it is they want to achieve. And come up with what we call a design or a blueprint, and then we do all the actual legal work in structuring the employee ownership. So that gets you as the owner of a company to the point where your company has become employee owned. So that's what we do in a nutshell. Over to Jeremy.
Robert, thank you. Good morning, everybody, and welcome. And to say, hopefully this will be more nourishing than the Brexit conversation. We help organisations really bring those structures to life. So we help organisations with their transition from their existing model into being an effective and well-organised, well-run, employee-owned businesses. What we don't do is implant a model on you. What we do is we work and we understand what you are trying to achieve for your employee ownership, and we help support that transition. So that's working with yourselves, with your senior leadership team, and with your key stakeholders. And that might include helping to establish and set up effective representative bodies, through to helping the owners actually work out their own responsibilities and roles with the organisations going forward. and we've been doing that for 5 years now. And I'm also a trustee director for 2 organisations, so I have trustee experience as well. I'm really looking forward to taking your questions and hopefully making this a good session for you.
Okay. I feel as if we should be sitting on a sofa, like breakfast television. What we actually have is 2 stools, very carefully arranged so that we are approximately the same height. I'm going to give you a little bit more context and background now. Very briefly, what is employee ownership? Let's start with that. So that really describes any company that is wholly or significantly owned by its employees. And significant could mean anything from 10% of a company's shares upwards. I think it's important not to be too hung up on percentages, because an awful lot of what makes employee ownership real is about culture and attitudes within the company. So you can have a company that's 10% employee owned, that can be have a really powerful employee ownership culture. What does employee ownership actually look like? So there are 3 main ways in which a company can be owned by its employees. So the first, which is probably going to sound pretty obvious, is all employees hold shares directly in the company. There is probably a relatively small number of companies that are employee owned in that way. The second, more common, is to have a majority of the shares, or a significant number, or in many cases all of the shares, held in a trust on behalf of the employees, often called an employee trust or an employee ownership trust. And then the third way of structuring employee ownership is to have a combination of those 2 things. So you might have a permanent block of shares held in trust, but an arrangement under which over a period of time the trust transfers shares through to individual employees. And reasons for having individual employee share ownership range from the attraction of being able to pay dividends to employees, through to enabling employees to enjoy capital growth in the value of their shares if the business grows in value. Right, we now have a whole load of questions actually that we've pre-prepared, so we can start by considering some of those, if that seems like the most useful thing to do. The first thing we thought we'd look at is for a question or a series of questions that a company or any company owner that's thinking about employee ownership should be asking themselves. So the first one is, why am I doing it? And I'm going to turn to Jeremy now and ask him to tell us about 1 or 2 of the conversations he's had with company owners that are thinking about going down this route.
Thank you. So it's really interesting, and possibly stating the obvious, but understanding why you look at employee ownership is a very good place to start. And for some people, it's around, they've looked at the alternatives. They've looked at a trade sale, and the statistics of that are not always encouraging. They've looked at potentially at a management buyout, and for reasons of possibly finance or others, that's been ruled out. And what they're really keen to do is they have over time built up a legacy, working with people, like-minded people who have offered a great service and do something very unique. And they don't want that lost, and they're concerned that a trade sale may put that at risk. And therefore there's a real element of legacy, and it's important to understand that, so that that forms the basis of your conversation as to why you're planning to take employee ownership. For others, it may be more financial. It may be the best way to extract a reasonable return for the business that you've built up. And again, that's perfectly legitimate, and having that conversation is really important. And why that matters is where we've seen organisations transition into employee ownership really successfully, is they're very confident about the reasons for what they are doing and why they are doing it. And they're able to engage their employees and their stakeholders as to the reason for this new model. And that conversation is reassuring for everybody, because it signifies the continuation of the organisation and the business under new leadership, but where everybody is working together to deliver the value that the organisation offers to their clients and their customers and their patients.
What we often find in conversations with companies that are relatively new to the idea of employee ownership is that they start off by having identified a whole load of things that they don't want to do. So just as Jeremy was saying, we don't want to sell to a third party, we don't like that idea, or we can't find a buyer. So we've been thinking around, seeing if there are any alternatives, and then we've come across this idea of employee ownership, and we started to look at it. And what then changes is they move from a kind of almost like a defensive position, like we know what we don't want to do, to something much more positive than that. This is for the companies for whom employee ownership feels like the right solution, and it won't be every single company. But there is a certain amount of self-selecting going on, and for those companies that do look on it, they quite quickly then begin to think, actually, this is really exciting. This solves our problems, but actually presents us with the possibility of doing something far better than we thought might be possible. So that's a little bit about the why. Another question, perhaps related, is, well, what am I looking to achieve? And that it's very important to achieve clarity on that, both for the company and for the employees, but also very importantly for the retiring owner or owners. So Jeremy, I'm sure, can tell you about one or two experiences he's had. I'll tell you about a company we have been working with, and they became owned by an employee ownership trust yesterday, and formally owned by 3 shareholders, 2 of whom are carrying on in the business, one of whom, it turns out, is definitely retiring. But he only made clear yesterday that he was definitely going to retire as a director. And there has been a big question mark over what he's actually going to do with his time. Is he going to carry on turning up for work when actually some very effective arrangements have been put in place so that he's no longer needed? Or is he going to completely sever his connection with the company? And as it turns out, he has completely severed his connection with the company. Now, nobody knows how he's going to spend his time, and we're not sure how much he's actually thought about that. But I guess the key thing from the company's point of view is they have really properly addressed the question of leadership succession, and they have the right people in place to move the company forward. Have you got any experience?
Yeah, several. I think one of the interesting things is I did some research some years ago, and one of the indicators of successful transition is that the owner actually knew what they were going to be doing. For some people, as Robert said, they want a clear break and they want to go away, they've got hobbies, or they want to invest their money in doing other things. For other people, actually, what they want to do is to return to the shop floor. And perhaps just do 1 or 2 days a week, doing what they used to do and what they enjoyed, which made them a successful business, and they want to hand the legacy of managing the business over to the organisation. And being really clear about that, as Robert said, is useful in 2 ways. It's very important for the business, but it also helps the owner with their change. I mean, selling your business in any form, whether it to an EO trust or to a third party or to the managers, is a very significant change for somebody to undertake. And whether you look at things like the Kubler-Ross model of change, where you're dealing with bereavement and you go through a process, it's really important yourself to take yourself through that process. And that way you're not inhibiting the success of the business. In fact, you're enhancing it. We worked with a business where the owner was very clear that absolutely nothing was really going to change. Now, there's some legal implications around the EOT that Robert can probably articulate more clearly than I can, but actually things do have to change, and that is arguably part of the reason why you're selling the business. Very often there's 2 processes going on at once here, and it's useful to understand that. One is about creating an employee-owned business, and that can be done independently and on its own. And the other is about succession planning, so about your own succession or your leadership team succession, and really thinking that through and understanding whether your business is equipped to continue without you is a very important consideration, and you need to give time and to plan for that. In fact, we both worked for a business that had a very rigorous planning process, and in fact, very cleverly, what they did is they used their own change model that they used within their organisation, and they put their EO transition through the change model. That had two really beneficial outcomes for them. Firstly, it was organised and thorough, and they understood that change model. And secondly, because it was the change model that the business used for their own internal development, everybody was used to the language. One of the things that we find when we're working with organisations is employee ownership isn't something that is most people's day job. Robert and I do it, and there are other people who are advising within this space as well. It is our day job. And actually, they're not too sure where to start. So anything that makes it comfortable and uses language that organisations are already familiar with will help aid that process.
Okay. So I understand we're getting some questions in. We could take a question or two now, or we can carry on to the next topic which we want to cover, which is governance. So let's do that. So what is governance? In many owner-managed companies, it probably seems irrelevant because the people running the company are also the people owning the company. So if you sit down with company owners and say, well, how many times do you actually have a formal board meeting? They may well say, never, or maybe once a year, or only if we need to approve a formal document. Once a company has become employee owned, this definitely has to change, because there is a separation between the people running the company, its leadership team, who will be its directors, and the owners of the company, who will either be employees individually, or a trust, or a combination of the two. So it's very important to have in place a really well thought through governance structure that makes very clear the relationship between the leaders and the owners, and the different rights and responsibilities that they have. So, for example, being clear to the trustees, and this is a question we often get asked, is do we actually run the company now? We're the trustees. Do we make all the decisions? To which the answer is, well, no, you don't. That's the role for the director still, but you might be called upon to give your permission to the company doing something really major, like buying another business. So those are the kind of things that we think about in planning a governance structure. To make it work, you need to spend time on it. You need to get your documents right. Of course, I would say that as a lawyer, that is important, but it's by no means the only part of the process. It's also important to have training. A lot of people come into a role in the governance in an employee-owned company completely unfamiliar with what it involves. So, for example, and in particular, if you become a trustee of an employee trust, generally you'll probably never have done that before. So, and it is a responsibility, and I think it's really important to have some training so that you know what you're taking on. And also commitment from everybody in the company. So, and in particular, commitment from the trustees, assuming there is a trust involved, and the leadership team, and actually the employees. So, if you're asking me to summarise what are the kind of key things in achieving good governance, this is me speaking from a lawyer's perspective, then that's what I would say. I'm going to turn to Jeremy now.
Yeah, and I think one of the things where we've seen really successful trust established, one of the questions is, what makes a good trustee? Fundamentally, it's good judgment. You clearly have some legal responsibilities, and training good judgment is really difficult. However, what we've noticed is when we've worked with organisations, people know within their peers and within their colleagues, who's sensible, who can who asks the right questions, who's able to really work through the issues at a kind of strategic level, and to engage with senior leaders in a positive way. And we find that the organisations who have the more effective trust models or trustee interaction are where they've actually explained to everybody in the organisation the role of the trustees. So very often they don't always appoint the elected trustees straight away, and this gives the organisation a bit of time to get used to the new ownership model, used to understanding how employee ownership works, and then when they come to elect their trustees, they invest a lot of time in actually helping everybody to understand what does a good trustee look like, what should they be doing. And this can be different to if you set up a elected representative body, which may be much more related to the kind of the operational challenge of the organisation, and where they're working with the senior leadership team to challenge, to influence, and to help them come up with operational solutions that allow them to be much more engaged and much more empowered by being employee owned, for which there's a greater job satisfaction, but also actually the organisation is able to meet its challenges much more fully because everybody's help and is focused on that. Those are quite different roles, and being able to articulate that to the employee owners is really useful, so they're able to make the right decision about who they think would be a good trustee if they have an elected trustee, or who would be a good representative on a representative body.
I think we've got one or two questions on governance. I'm going to ask Kathy a couple of questions. First, shall we take a question or two, Kathy?
Yes, I think it would probably be useful to do that in this topic. So.
Okay. And the second question, also aimed at Kathy, apologies, is do we click on the Q&A at the bottom to put the question?
I will manage all of that for you, and I will ask you the questions.
Okay, great. Here we go then.
So you have covered beautifully, actually, a number of the questions that have already come in. So congratulations to you both for doing that. It must be psychic mind power, I think. But one of the particularly interesting ones that's come in is, as an established employee-owned business that didn't set up any employee representation in the first place, because obviously there's you with a council or anything, you don't have to do that. We would just consider it to be a good governance structure to do that. How do you persuade the management team that creating a place for an elected employee rep on the trust board or as a body is actually a useful thing?
Sorry, how do you persuade the board that having a representative body is a good thing?
Well, no, so you've got a trust. You've got people on that trust, but you aren't necessarily representing the employees on that trust, because that isn't how you've set it up in the first place. But you've now decided that might be a good idea, but management are probably very status quo and, well, it works as it is. So how do you make the case for increased employee representation? Okay,
and I think the fact that you're asking the question, or the question's asking the question, starts to form the case. And I think there's a lot of common sense in the fact of saying, if the organisation is, let's assume it's the trust model, if the organisation is owned on behalf of the employee owners, then having employee owners on the trust and forming that virtual circle is really important. I think one of the things that to understand is that when you become employee owned, at one level, literally the ownership of the organisation has changed, and you could say nothing else has changed. The structure still works, the leadership still lead the business, and they're accountable to somebody. It's a trust body now, as opposed to a previous owner. And at one level, nothing's changed. Equally, you could flip that on a head and say, actually, everything's changed. Because if it's, say, a majority trust model where the majority of shares are held in the benefit of the employees, then actually you start to ask the question, who's working for who? And this can be quite challenging, and this is often where the leadership team can feel vulnerable and feel uncomfortable about being held to account by the employee owners. And I think you have to recognise that and have an honest conversation to say, how do we ensure that actually what we're doing is we're getting employee representation at the senior level to help build and help engage with the organisation and allow them to get the best data in order to make those decisions at an operational level. I think for me, where I'm a trustee on 2 organisations, I would feel it really difficult coming in as an external trustee to an organisation where there is no employee representation on that trust model, because all the data I would have would be the financial accounts and what the MD or whoever is co-opted onto that body can give me. And actually having, where I've worked with the organisations where they've got employee reps, it's incredibly, employee elected trustees, it's incredibly helpful to get that input, to have that conversation. And whilst we, yes, as Robert said, we don't run the company, that's not our job at all. Having that input about how the messages are landing, how the strategy is being interpreted at the coalface is really helpful. So I think there are several conversations that you could have with your senior team as the advantages of this. But recognizing it can be difficult, and you have to look at those advantages. And clearly the data says that the more people are engaged in an organization, the more successful those organizations are.
Would there be any benefit, do you think, in the leadership team in the company, from the person that asked the question, being introduced to a leader from a team in another company which does have employee representation and can talk about their experience of how it's worked, on a kind of warts and all basis? Maybe that would be something else to think about.
Always a good way to go, absolutely. I've got another hopefully reasonably brief one on this one, and then we'll hand back to you guys for your next direction. So how do you find good independent trustees for EO businesses? Do you need to pay them? And is there a correct proportion of elected trustees per head of employees, if you like?
Shall I have a go at that? Independent trustees, yes, they generally do expect to be paid. I think we've worked with one company quite recently where the independent trustee was doing it for interest and maybe even pleasure, but definitely not for money. But that's very unusual. It's generally something that people would expect to be paid for. The time commitment is probably overall a minimum of 4 days a year. Sometimes it's significantly more than that. So you have to expect people to want to be paid to make that sort of professional time available. As we speak, there isn't yet a phalanx of potential professional trustees out there. Although we think the number of people who are willing to take on this role is growing. What we often say when asked this question by the companies we work with is, well, you could start by, if you happen to know somebody in your industry, or maybe one of your professional advisors, your lawyer or your accountant, maybe they'd be prepared to take on the role. Either of those can work quite well. Yep. If not, then we can have another think and see what other possibilities there might be. Yeah. In terms of the kind of recommended balance, I think it very much is going to depend on the company. So we generally say, yeah, it's an employee trust, so you really should have an employee, at least one. If you don't feel comfortable with that to start with, then you could start off without an employee trustee. But I think you should have a plan to have one in place fairly soon. And generally we find that there is at least one in place right from the start, because it's a very important part of the foundation for making the employees feel like owners. So yeah, at least one employee, strongly recommended. An independent person, also strongly recommended. A minimum of 3 altogether. Yeah. And this will depend on the size of the company. So the third one could be another employee, could be another independent person, or maybe one of the retiring shareholders. But there is lots of different models.
Perfect, thank you, Robert. So back over to you guys.
And I wonder if I could just add, I think one thing to bear in mind is that the trust, the makeup of the trustees can change. You can increase or decrease. And I think there is a conversation to be had, particularly once, because often these transaction can be vendor financed. Once the vendor is paid out, and if you look at 100% employee ownership model, there is a very valid conversation to have to say, well, actually, should you, if it's 100% owned on behalf of the employees, should you have a majority of employee owners, trustees? So it's a very good conversation to have, and I think it does vary. I think I would also echo or reinforce Robert's point. You don't need to necessarily start off with elected trustees, and this will very much, I think, depend on the organisation and where the organisation is with its transition and its communication. Sometimes the trust board will take a little bit of time to settle in, to establish that kind of sort of storming phase, and sometimes that can be a little bit disconcerting for an elected trustee who's heard that they've got these experts in, and they're sitting there and they don't seem to know kind of from the start how they're going to make this work. That's not unusual, and I think having some time to bed in can be an advantage. Other organisations say, well, we want to form it together. It will very much depend on the organisation and their own experience with setting up these type of engagement platforms.
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you. Those two really interesting questions to explore. We're going to move on now to answer a question we've asked ourselves, which is, what are some of the most commonly overlooked areas when a company transitions to becoming employee owned? So we're planning to share the benefit of our own experience through some of the companies we worked with. So I'm going to start off with saying failure properly to think about leadership succession. And the best way of exploring that, I think, is by telling you a very brief story about one of the companies we have worked with who definitely didn't properly think about leadership succession. So this was a company which had a very charismatic managing director who was also the 100% owner. In a type of business where relationships with clients and customers are of supreme importance. He sold his shares to an employee ownership trust. He immediately took a back seat, massively reduced his involvement in the business, made a fairly half-hearted stab at putting in place a new managing director, but it became clear after not very long that that person wasn't up to the job. And since then, they've been on damage limitation and trying to rectify the situation, and they still haven't cracked it. So it would have been a lot better for them if they'd gone more slowly with their transition to employee ownership and really prepared a lot more carefully for what was going to happen when the owners stepped back from the business. So that's my example.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's often overlooked is whilst the EOA are doing a fantastic job in providing education and obviously I would say that and information to help businesses transition, it is still a relatively small and very unknown area. And we find that even where organisations have made contact with the EOA or professional advisors like ourselves or others, they're taking a long time to, and rightly so, to understand what they're doing. As we've said, be clear about what your own ideas are, what your own plans are, and to formulate a plan. And by a long time, this could be months, in some cases years. I was invited down to Riverford Organics a couple of weeks ago to celebrate, joining their celebration of their anniversary. And Guy Watson was very clear how long he had taken and wrestled with this idea. And one of the, once the owner has made the decision and has gone through the change and has organised it and got a plan, has engaged the lawyers and others to help with this, by the time they get to the point of handing over and signing, it can feel a bit of a release and thinks, right, we're done. And actually, what we always say is just understand how long it's taken for you to get your mind around this and to understand what you're doing, and to afford your organisation, if not the same time, sufficient time to really understand what this is going to mean for them individually and as an organisation, and to allow them that time to make that adjustment. It is a massive change, potentially, and you really need to plan that through and to be supportive for those who are going to undertake that. Also, as touched on by Robert, be really clear about your external key stakeholders as well. Your communication plan for your announcement is really important. In this day and age of social media, once something's out, it can move quite quickly. So if you have key client relationships or customer relationships where your interaction with them may be subject to you as an individual or your ownership structure, you need to make quite sure that you've got them keyed up to engage at the appropriate time as well. So I think, you know, one of the things is to really make quite sure that you afford others and yourself the time needed to come to terms with this, and to question, to have a Q&A question sheet available so that you can answer and reassure people and be very open about what's happening.
The flip side, excuse me, the flip side of the leadership succession challenge is, of course, the concern about letting go, people who should be stepping back who aren't doing. Jeremy, I know that you've had some experience of at least one company where that's turned out to be quite a big issue. Can you share a little bit of your experience with that company?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we had one organisation, or we worked with one organisation, where in fact the role of the previous owner becoming a trustee was not really understood, and despite probably receiving great advice, they really didn't understand either the trustee or the chief exec of that organisation really understand what that meant. And in essence, the previous owner was trying to run the business after the transition, and that caused quite a bit of tension and quite a bit of animosity, I think, and sadly, you know, affected a relationship where they've been working together for a long time. So that I think is where it's gone wrong. Equally, the other side is where it's gone well, and actually where people are really clear with everybody what their plan is. So we actually say, look, if you're going to still be involved with the organisation, you know, maybe time to give up your office. If you've got a car park space, give that up as well, so that people can see that things have changed. I mean, I used to work in John Lewis, and it wasn't unusual, certainly when I was there, for people to refer back to, say, what Speed Lewis might have said or thought, and he'd been dead for some time. So if you've started in a company and your DNA is part of that organisation, you've created that legacy, be aware that your very presence, even inside the building, will often impact the way people think and behave.
Just one more thing before we move on. Also on the letting go points, a company we've been working with, partly owned by an employee trust. One of the trustees is the former controlling shareholder of the company, who has been continuing to, or at least attempt to, micromanage the company by firing highly detailed questions on a regular basis about the company's finances without any consultation with their fellow trustees. And rather brutally, I think the way that's probably going to turn out is that he's going to be replaced as a trustee, because it's time to move on. Okay, so letting go. Next thing we want to cover, and I think this is the kind of last formal thing we had on our agenda, is just to think about, well, what really changes in a company that has moved into employee ownership? And I'm going to slightly recast that question by saying, well, what should change? So what do you expect? What changes do you expect to see in a successful employee-owned company? We've talked about stepping back. The owners do need to step back, generally. Employee engagement is the second thing, and that is absolutely fundamental to any company becoming successfully employee-owned. If the employees don't really understand what employee ownership means, aren't really interested in it, then it's not going to work. So that kind of aspect of the people side of employee ownership is absolutely fundamental. That's something that does need to change. And that's something that you get, Jeremy, you get regularly involved in.
Yeah, we do. And we think one of the things that helps bring that to life is to be really clear about the rights of the employee, or the benefits, what the responsibilities are as well. So if you've got rights, you'll have responsibilities. But also a lot of conversation around engagement you could have for any organisation. You know, good engagement helps any organisation, and we wouldn't kid ourselves that only employee-owned businesses have great engagement. However, the unique factor, I think, that comes with an employee-owned business is the opportunities that it affords you. So the opportunities to be involved either at a senior level as a trustee or as an operational representative within an organisation, or the ability to have more decision-making, delegated decision-making. There's a lots of areas where you can have increased opportunities. I had a conversation with a wonderful organisation recently, and they said one of the challenges that we face is we bring in very young, talented individuals who will stay with us for 3, 4, 5 years and then move on. You know, it's not like John Lewis in the old days where you had employment for life, etc. Those organisations, those things don't exist anymore anyway. But you know, how do we make employee ownership relevant to them? And we think if you can have a conversation about being really clear about what the benefits, the rights are about being employee owned, what your responsibilities are around being an employee owner, and also what your opportunities are, you can have a legitimate conversation when people come into your organisation saying, we recognise you may not stay forever, but what we would want within this framework is that when you leave, both you and us are stronger and better because of our relationship. And having an understanding about the rights, responsibilities and opportunities as an employee-owned business and as an employee owner really helps then you drive that engagement conversation.
Do you think, excuse me, do you think leadership styles need to change in a company that has become employee-owned, or will it depend on the leaders who are already there?
I think it will depend. I mean, we've worked with one business who were very hierarchical, and they were clear that wasn't going to change. They said it's been successful for us, why would we want to change that? I do think if you want to get the benefit out of employee ownership, and if you use what we were just talking about, understanding your rights, responsibilities and opportunities, one of the responsibilities may be to treat information, sensitive information, and keep it confidential, and you have that conversation. Therefore, your opportunity is to be given more data, more information, so that you can make better informed decisions. You can understand the challenges that the business is facing, and therefore leadership need to be attuned and adapt to sharing information in a way that maybe in the past they haven't had to. So less command and control, more engaged coach and mentoring, so that people are enabled to make better decisions themselves. That is a different style of leadership. That is really about sharing the benefits of employee ownership and sharing the benefits of responsibility, which is around being able to make more decisions where appropriate. This is often one of the challenges that we find that organisations have with middle management, particularly in the early days of transition. The board will have got their head around kind of what this means for them. They are now very often accountable to a trust board, where before they were accountable to the benevolent owner. Some might say benevolent dictator, but that's going to be a change for them, and they understand things are going to be different. Very often, people during the messaging, your employees will hear that actually it's about sharing responsibility, and there's going to be a bonus, or there's going to be some other things that they're going to get as being employee owned. And the management in the middle can often feel quite squeezed. They're told now to lead in a different way, to be more engaging, to be more open, but also they're sometimes challenged from others to say, well, it's my business now and I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do. And actually equipping your active middle management in being able to lead people through an engaging way and to understand really what are their rights, what are their responsibility, and what are their opportunities as leaders within the organisation is a really important conversation to have, and often where we find these things get stuck.
I think a good note for us to finish on before we go back and see if there are any more questions is just to circle back to the employees. And it's really important in terms of, again, what really changes in an employee-owned company is that there is a tangible benefit for the employees. So they're not saying, well, what was that all about then? Nothing's really changed. You know, why are we employee-owned? What difference does it make? And partly that can be financial. So, for example, we've managed to go through the whole webinar without talking about tax at all, which I think is great, because whilst there are tax reliefs available, nobody should ever become employee-owned just for the tax reasons. But there is an opportunity to pay employees an income tax-free bonus if a company is owned by an employee ownership trust. So that's one really obvious, easy win in your first year is to increase, if the profits are there, to increase, even by initially a relatively modest amount, what the employees are receiving in their pay packet by giving them an income tax-free bonus. Of course, it's not just about the financial side, but that is one way of starting to make the ownership feel real. So do we have any more questions?
We do. We have very little time, however, so I'm going to put you both on the spot with a really quick answer to a final question, and then we'll wrap up. So we're talking there engagement generally sort of through and just post-transition. Is it different when perhaps you're 20 years down the line into employee ownership? What do you do with engagement then?
I think it's a bit like having a dog at Christmas. It's not for Christmas, it's for life. And I think employee ownership is not different to that. You have to invest in it. You have to retrain. You have to keep this conversation alive. And I think that's one of the really valuable contributions that an elected representative body can do. It holds the leadership's feet to the flame. And if you've got some guiding principles or legacy document that indicates why you became employee owned in the beginning, and you can have conversations around that, that's really helpful.
Perfect.
I'm not going to add anything. Sitting next to someone who spent many years at John Lewis, which a mature employee-owned organisation. So I think that's great from Jeremy.
It is, and that's a perfect way to end. So thank you both for being our expert advisors on this very first webinar from the EOA. For any of you who haven't had questions answered, we obviously have a record of them, and we will put Robert and Jeremy's contact details up in the closing slide as well. So please feel free to speak to them directly should you wish to. They'll both be very happy to do that and to chat with you. So thank you as participants for trusting us to deliver this first webinar. I think we could have gone on for at least twice the time very easily. So rest assured that we will undoubtedly do more of this. And I would also like to thank very much Hannah from the EOA, who has set this up and guided us through technically and been a tower of strength and calm throughout it all. And it's been a real pleasure to us to bring this to you. And we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay, thank you for listening.
Bye.